In this lesson, we're going to be focusing on just two things. We will explore the basics and benefits of JSX and make you aware of React and JSX gotchas. In programming, a gotcha is a feature of a system, a program or a programming language that works in a way that is documented, but is counterintuitive and almost invites mistakes. By now, you will know that JSX is the syntax in React. Create React app already bootstrapped a boilerplate application for you. So let's have a closer look at how we can use JSX in React. JSX is a JavaScript extension that provides syntactic sugarcoating for function calls and object construction. It may look like a template engine or HTML, but it isn't. JSX produces React elements whilst allowing you to harness the full power of JavaScript. JSX is a great way to write React components because it provides an improved developer experience. It makes the code easier to read because it's more eloquent, and this is thanks to an XML-like syntax that's better at representing nested declarative structures. It also makes for more productive team members. With JSX, casual developers, such as designers, can modify code more easily because it looks like HTML, which they are already familiar with. It also results in fewer wrist injuries and syntax errors. With JSX, developers have less code to actually type, that is, less sugarcoating, which means they make fewer mistakes and thus are less likely to develop repetitive stress injuries. Trust me, it's a thing. And although JSX isn't required for React, it does fit in nicely and is highly recommended by React creators. To demonstrate the eloquence of JSX, take a look at this code to create Hello World and a link statement. In essence, JSX is a small language with an XML-like syntax that's changed the way that people write UI components. Previously, developers wrote HTML and JS code for controllers and views in an MVC-like manner, jumping between various files. That stemmed from the separation of concerns in the early days. This approach served the web well, and it consisted of static HTML, a little CSS, and a tiny bit of JavaScript to make the text blink. This is no longer the case today. We build highly interactive UIs, and JS and HTML are tightly coupled to implement various pieces of functionality. Previously, developers wrote HTML and JS code for controllers and views in an MVC-like manner, jumping between various files. This stemmed from the separation of concerns in the early days. This approach served the web well when it consisted of static HTML, a little CSS, and a tiny bit of JS to make the text blink. Now, this is no longer the case today. Today, we build highly interactive UIs, and JS and HTML are tightly coupled to implement various pieces of functionality. React fixes the broken separation of concerns principle by bringing together the description of the UI and the JS logic. And with JSX, the code looks like HTML and is easier to read and write. If for no other reason, we should use React and JSX just for this new approach to writing UIs. JSX is compiled by various transformers or tools into standard ECMA script. You probably know that JavaScript is ECMA script, but unlike JavaScript, JSX isn't a part of the specification and it doesn't have any defined semantics. And this may have you wondering, then why on earth should I bother with JSX? And that's a valid question, considering how counterintuitive JSX code looks like to begin with. It's no surprise that at first, many developers may be turned off by this amazing technology. The main reason to use JSX is that many people find code with angle brackets easier to read than code with a lot of React.create element statements, even when they are aliased. Once you get into the habit of thinking about name not as XML, but as an alias to JavaScript code, well, then you get over the perceived weirdness of JSX syntax. Knowing and using JSX can make a big difference when you're developing React components and subsequently React powered applications. And did you know? JSX is not a requirement for using React. Using React without JSX is especially convenient when you don't want to set up a compilation in your build environment. So let's delve in a little deeper and explore how JSX makes it easier to write React applications. Creating React element objects with JSX is pretty straightforward. For example, instead of writing the following JavaScript, you can write this JSX. In the JSX code, the attributes and their values, for example, key1 equal value1, come from the second argument of the create element. We'll be focusing on working with properties a little bit later. And this is a more advanced iteration of Hello World, rewritten in JSX. In this case, you create a new component class and use JSX to create an element from it. This is easier to read than the following pure JavaScript code that looks like this. Seeing angle brackets in JavaScript code may seem a bit strange for experienced JavaScript developers. Oh, and notice parentheses after return in the JSX code. You must include them if you don't type anything on the same line after return. For example, if you start your top element, div, on a new line, you must put parentheses around it like this. Otherwise, JavaScript will finish the return with nothing. In the previous lesson, Create React App already bootstrapped a boilerplate application for us. All files come with default implementations. Let's dive into the source code. The only file that you'll touch in the beginning will be the src/app.js file. Don't get confused by the import and export statements and the class declaration. These features are already JavaScript ES6. In the file, you have a React ES6 class component with the name app. It is a component declaration. Basically, after you've declared a component, you can use it as an element anywhere in your application. It will produce an instance for your component. In other words, the component gets instantiated. The element that it returns is specified by the render method. Elements are what components are made of. It's useful to understand the difference between component, instance, and element. The content in the render block looks pretty similar to the HTML, but it's JSX. JSX allows you to mix HTML and JavaScript. It is powerful, yet confusing when you're used to separating your HTML and JavaScript. And that's why a good starting point is to use basic HTML in your JavaScript. In the beginning, remove all the distracting content in the file, and the code will look like this. Now, you only return HTML in your render method without JavaScript. Let's define the welcome to the road to learn React as a variable. A variable can be used in your JSX by using curly brackets, like this. It should work when you start your application on the command line with npm start again. You might have noticed that the class name attribute reflects the standard class attribute in HTML. Because of technical reasons, JSX had to replace a handful of internal HTML attributes. Element properties are defined using attribute syntax. That is, we use key1 equals value1, key2 equals value2 notation inside of the JSX tag to define both HTML attributes and React component properties. This is similar to attribute syntax in HTML or XML. In other words, if you need to pass properties, write them in JSX as you would in normal HTML. Also, you render standard HTML attributes by setting element properties. For example, this code sets a standard HTML attribute href for the anchor element A. Using hardcore values for attributes isn't flexible. If you want to reuse the link component, then the href must change to reflect a different address each time. This is called dynamically setting values versus hard coding them. Let's go a step further. For a component that can use dynamically generated values for attributes, those values can come from component properties this.props. After that, everything is easy. All you need to do is use curly brackets inside angle brackets to pass dynamic values of properties to elements. For example, suppose you're building a component that will be used to link to user accounts.href, and the title must be different and not hard coded. Dynamic component outputting variables in JSX render a standard HTML attribute href. This sets a value for the username property, Introduction to JSX. Profile link renders a link A using the properties URL and label for href and title, respectively. In profile link, you pass the properties to A using this. And you may be asking, where do the property values come from? They are defined when the profile link is created, that is, in the component that creates profile link. For example, this is how the values for URL and label are passed when a profile link instance is created, which results in the render of the A tag with those values. When rendering standard elements, React renders all attributes from the HTML specification and omits all other attributes that aren't a part of the specification. This isn't a JSX gotcha, it's React's behavior. Sometimes you want to add custom data as an attribute. Let's say you have a list item, and there's some information that's essential to your app, but not needed by users. A common pattern is to put this information in the DOM element as an attribute. Let's take a look at this example using the attributes React is awesome and ID. As a developer, you're free to write any component methods for your applications because a React component is a class. For example, you can create a helper method, getURL. The getURL method isn't sophisticated, but you do get the idea. You can create your own arbitrary methods, not just render. You can use the getURL method to abstract a URL to your API server. Helper methods can have reusable logic, and you can call them anywhere within other methods of the component, including render. If you want to output the return from the custom method in JSX, use curly brackets, just as you would with variables, like this. In this case, the helper method is invoked in render, and the method's return values will be used in the view. Remember to invoke the method with brackets. Developers need to compose their components. Components must be able to change views based on the results of if-else conditions. Let's start with a simple example that renders the elements in a component class. The elements depend on a condition. For example, some link text and URL are determined by the user.session value. You would code this in plain JavaScript like this. You can use a similar approach and rewrite that code with JSX like this. The following ternary condition works in that if user.auth is true, then message will be set to welcome. Otherwise, the value will be restricted. This statement is equivalent to this. A quick side note, the term ternary means composed of 3 parts. You probably knew that already. If you did, well done. If you didn't, next time. Comments in JSX work in a similar way to comments in regular JavaScript. To add JSX comments, you can wrap standard JavaScript comments in curly brackets, like this. Or you can use comments like this. Of course, you are welcome to snap and save any code snippet that you see here and refer to at any point that you'd like. Alternatively, you can find them in your summary notes for this lesson. Now that you've had a taste of JSX, it's time to see some of its benefits. And for the final section of this lesson, we're going to be looking at a few gotchas, the ones that you need to be aware of when you use JSX in React. As a really witty programmer once put on a better explained website, gotchas are itty bitty details that will bite you because you didn't say the secret word or rub your belly 3 times whilst pressing the enter key. Gotcha! For starters, there's the closing slash. For instance, JSX requires you to have a closing slash either at the closing tag or if you don't have any children and use a single tag, in the end of that single tag. For example, this is correct, and this is not correct because the slashes are missing. HTML tends to be far more fault tolerant. Most browsers will ignore the missing slash and render the elements just fine without it. The S attribute in JSX works differently from plain HTML. With JSX, instead of a string, you need to pass a JavaScript object, and CSS properties need to be in camel case. For example, font-size becomes font size, one word. Font-family becomes font family, one word. And background-image becomes background image, one word. You can save the JavaScript object in a variable or render it in line without double curly brackets. The double brackets are needed because one set is for JSX and the other is for the JavaScript object literal. And for those of you that don't know, medial capitals or camel case is when the first letter of each word in a compound word is capitalized, except for the first word. Software developers often use it when writing source code where element names cannot contain spaces. Suppose we have an object with this font size. In your JSX, you can use the small font size object like this. Let's have another example of passing styles directly. This time, you're setting a red border on span, like this. React and JSX accept any attribute that's a standard HTML attribute, except class and for. Those names are reserved keywords in JavaScript and ECMA script, and when JSX is converted into regular JavaScript, use class name and HTML instead. For example, if you have a class hidden, you can define it in a div, like this. And last but certainly not least is some attributes such as disabled, required, checked, autofocus, and read only are specific only to form elements. The most important thing to remember here is that the attribute value must be set in the JavaScript expression, that is, inside curly brackets, and not strings. For example, use false to enable the following input. And this brings us to our demo for the lesson. I'm going to show you how to create React components in both ways, with and without JSX. We will create 2 components and render them from the main app component. Let's do it. So, JSX is an extended formatting to JavaScript, which is similar to template language, but has the full power of JavaScript. JSX behaves into calls to the react.createElement function, which returns an abstract JavaScript object called reactElements. As I mentioned earlier, we defined our React component using HTML-like syntax, known as JSX. JSX is the syntax extension to JavaScript. We use JSX to construct a virtual DOM with the React elements, and Facebook released JSX to provide concise syntax for creating complex DOM trees with attributes. They hope to make React more readable, like HTML and XML. So now let's open up our previous project. And inside the src folder, let's close all the components first. And then inside src folder, I have a couple of files. So we have index.js And inside index.js, there is a main entry point for our app. So index.js is the main entry point for our application. So as you can see over here, we render our app component. An application built with just React usually has a single root DOM node. In index.js, we import both from the React library and also import React DOM from the React DOM library. React is the library for creating views, and React DOM is the library used to render the UI in the browser. The two libraries were split into two packages, and the purpose for splitting these two elements is to allow for components to be shared between the web version of the React and React Native. Alright, so now let's go to our app.js. And inside app.js, we have a function-based component called app. Every React application has at least one component, the root component named app in app.js. Note that in JSX, any element that has an HTML class attribute is using class name for that property instead of class, since class is a reserved word in JavaScript. We have to use class name to define. The class attribute of an HTML element, if you can see over here, we use class name to define this div element. A component has to return a single React element. In our case, app returns a single div. The element can be a representation of native DOM component, such as div or another composite component that you have defined yourself. So let's close the terminal and take a look at this JSX code. And all of these JSX are single div elements. So the funny tax syntax returned by component is not HTML but JSX. JSX is the syntax extension to JavaScript, and we use it to describe what the UI should be like. HTML in JSX elements type is specified with the tag. The tag's attributes represent the properties. And also, the element's children can be added between the opening and closing tags. And because our app currently has quite a bit of boilerplate code, we will delete some of the content and start with a simpler app.js. So let's delete all of these, and now we will define in our app component. We need to put first div, and inside that div, I will just return h1 of hello world. Hello world. I will save this and I will open up the new terminal and I will change the directory to my app folder. And then I'll press enter. And then I'll type nmp start to start our application. And this should open a new tab for us. And it asks me, would you like to run the app in another port instead? And I'll say yes. And this will open up a new tab of our application, and it just rendered hello world to the screen. So what we have in this code is we have a function-based component called app, as evident from the function declaration. The function returns a JSX template in a single React element. So the HTML code over here is a part that will be written into the component's rendering area. Yes, we simply type HTML direct into JavaScript statement. Again, this functionality is enabled by installing the JSX plugin from your Node.js via Babel. So now let's add another element inside the div. and that will be h2. And that will just be welcome to React. And then save the file and check, and you'll find h2 welcome to React rendered to the screen. So the benefit of the div element is to compose all components inside the div. Okay, so let's have a problem and see if we remove the div element and then save the file, we find an error, and it says JSX element must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And we can solve this easily by going back to our div element and then wrap the two HTML elements inside it. When you save it and take a look, you'll find that everything works out perfectly and everyone is happy. Now, a question that you might have before JSX was introduced is, how do we create elements to render to the DOM in React? Which is a great question. The answer is by using the react.createElement. So we can use both options, JSX to create component or without JSX. So now let's take a look at how we can create a component. Alright, let's delete all of this and then start from scratch. So to create a component, first we need to import React from React. And then let's define our component. We will make it a class component. We call it hello world, and then we use extends react.component. And then we open up our curly brackets. This should be a capital letter. And then we will use the render method because it's a class. And then open up the curly brackets. And then we will return react.createElement. And then we will pass 3 parameters. The first one is the type of the HTML that we want to use, which is h1 in this case. And then we will use a comma and pass our second element, which is the class name. Then a colon, and then I will call it title. And the last element is the actual text that we want to render to the screen. So let's use hello world again. And if I save this file, I should get hello world rendered to the screen. There we go. So that's a way that we can use to create a React component without JSX. Let's comment all of this by highlighting and Control// and see how we can do the same thing using JSX. We will use the same class, hello world. Extends react.component. And then I will use the render method. And open up curly brackets. And then I will return h1. h1. Hello world. And when I save the file, over here I need to export default hello world. And then when I save the file, I should get the same result rendered to the screen. And these are the two ways of creating elements in React. And as you can see, using JSX, we can write an HTML in JavaScript. And it's a lot more clean. It's a cleaner way to write the code. So now we are just using our app.js component. And the big benefit of using React to write a web application is by nesting components. So we can go to src and create new file, and let's type welcome.js. And hit enter. And now let's create another example and import it in app.js to render to the screen. The way we do that is the same way we created the component hello world. So we import React from React. Then you can do it like a function component. I will use the arrow function, and I'll type const.welcome equal. Then I would open parenthesis, and in this case I'm not taking any parameter. So I will use the arrow function, and this will return h1. Say welcome to React, and I'll come here again and write export default welcome, our component name. So now I'll save this component and I'll go to app.js. And just after the hello world, and then I should put parenthesis because I will render two things. And again, I'll come here and close that parenthesis. Let me close this one and render h2, or I just call the component directly. So I'll type welcome component, and I will put a backslash. And then I close this, and I have to come here and import welcome component from ./welcome. And as you can see, Visual Studio Code suggested the welcome component over here. I will just press over here, and I should enclose all of this in a single div. And then I should take this one and include the two elements inside the single div. And now when I save this, I should get hello world first, and then the elements inside the welcome component. Welcome to React after that. So let's check. Let's refresh this quickly. Aha, we get an error. So it says nothing was written from render. Okay, so let's fix this by going back to our code. So if you go to the error message, it says nothing was returned from render. So where is that? In welcome components. So we will go to welcome component, and that's because we haven't used the return method. So we use the return, and then save the file, and then we can open brackets like this. and then save the file and check again. And there we go, you find hello world and welcome to React rendered to the screen. So this is the way that we use JSX in React component. So this brings us to the end of our demo. Now you can play and create your own components, and we'll see you in the next lesson. Goodbye, everyone.